Swatching is the single most important thing that you can do with your knitting. If you're following a pattern, you'll notice that it has a gauge. And a gauge is the amount of stitches or rows per 4 inches, and it's written over 4 inches because if I were to measure 1 inch of my swatch in different places, I would get different stitch counts most likely. So we do it over 4 inches or 10 centimeters depending on where you live to get a more accurate reading. I definitely recommend that you make your swatch as big as you can. I know it's super tedious and very boring to knit, but it's extremely important to know if your gauge is going to be the same. So you want your gauge to match whatever pattern that you're following or a pattern that you're writing. You want the gauge to be accurate. If you've ever knit like a really tiny swatch and then wondered why your final product came out the wrong size, it's because your swatch was too small. So you really want your swatch to be between 6 and 8 inches wide and tall. Something like this is going to be incredibly inaccurate. This is probably 4 inches by 4 inches. I knit this just to test out a couple rows of something, not to measure a gauge. Now, if something that you're knitting doesn't really need to be the correct size, like a baby blanket or a shawl or a scarf, then you can knit a smaller one. I think that doesn't matter that much. So here my swatch is about 8 inches wide here, or 20 centimeters, and about almost 7 inches tall, and what is that, like 17.5 centimeters. This is a very ideal size. When I start counting, I always kind of measure out about 5 or 6 inches and then count over however many stitches. And then I write that down, and I do that multiple times, and I kind of move my measuring tape. I'll measure between 4 and 8 inches of width. So I'll move it over and measure like 5 here, and I can get like 6 here. You want to avoid the edges because the edge stitches are usually a little wonky. So you want to stay like maybe a little bit in from the edge. So I could easily get 6 inches here, and I could move it over and get like a nice 4 in the middle. Could get a nice 5 here, and I just move it around throughout my swatch and take measurements, and then I write them all down on a sheet of paper, and I take the average of all of those. So let's say that I end up with something like this. I'm going to break these down per 1 inch, and you can do the same thing per like 2.5 centimeters if you work in centimeters. So I just take the stitch count divided by the inches. So 20.5 divided by 4 is 5.125, and you just go on down the line. And this is what I get per 1 inch. I took some that were 4 inches, 5, 6, and if I have a larger swatch, I'll go 7 and 8 inches. And I'll take about 6 or 7 of these measurements just for the stitch count, and then repeat the same process for the row count. So I'll go 5 inches down, 4 inches down, and I always go at least 4 and up to like 8 if I have the room. And I move it around my swatch to take different measurements in different places so I can get a really nice average. So again, same thing with the row count. You want to avoid the top and avoid the very bottom. So you want to leave yourself a bit of space here. Your stitches can be a little wonky at the cast on and the bind off, although I definitely don't recommend doing a bind off when you're making a swatch. We'll get to that, but here I've just put my stitches on waste yarn, and I find that to be a much better way to do it because it lets these stitches lay how they naturally would lay instead of like puckering or stretching out. If I were to bind off and it was too tight, this whole top would kind of angle in a little bit, which would not be good for getting an accurate read. And the same thing if my bind off was too loose, it would flare out and I would just get kind of an inaccurate read for this whole section. The cast on is, I think, not as important. Some people will tell you to do a provisional cast on, but honestly, I think that's just way too much work. I just do a fairly average tension long tail cast on for me pretty much every time, and that's the most common cast on that I use in general, so it works out really well. Going back to our stitch count gauge, so we have all these that we took and we turn them into their 1 inch counterparts, and now I just take the average because these are super close. Now let's say I have an outlier. I have like one that ends up being like 6 stitches per 1 inch. Because it's so far off from all the rest and it's so different and it's only one case of it, that tells me I either miscounted or there's a section of my swatch that is a little bit off because the rest of them are incredibly similar. So if there's a huge outlier like that, I just cross it out and ignore it. And then I take the average and I end up with 5.22 stitches per 1 inch. So then I multiply that by 4. And there was a few extra numbers here, but I just rounded it. So in my calculator, I just hit multiply by 4 and I get 20.897 stitches equals 4 inches. And that would be ridiculous to work with. So I'm going to round it up to 21 stitches equals 4 inches. And then do that same process for my row gauge. But that will give me a very accurate reading of my gauge. So if you're getting too many stitches in your gauge, let's say for example that you end up with 20 stitches but you need 18 stitches, you'll want to go up a needle size because your stitches are too small. And if you go up a needle size, your stitches will get a little bit bigger, and so there will be fewer in 1 inch. And if you're getting too few stitches, that means that your stitches are too big and you need to go down a needle size. So here's an example of a swatch that I started. So I definitely recommend that you go for something that's at least 6 inches wide up to 10 inches, although I think 10 inches is a bit of overkill. So a minimum of 6 inches until about 8 inches, I think, is the sweet spot. And the same thing goes for knitting rows. You want to make something that looks kind of square. You want to cast on a width that's about, 6 to 8 inches and then knit a length that is about that long too. Definitely don't go any smaller than 6 inches though. I know it's very tempting. It's extremely tedious to knit a giant swatch, but if you really want the thing you're knitting to be the right size, especially if you're knitting a garment, especially if you're putting money into the garment and a lot of time to knit it, take the time in the beginning to knit a swatch. It'll save you a lot of heartache in the end. So you might notice that a lot of my swatches have these little tails. Some of them are cut really short, some of them are cut long, and some of them aren't cut at all. Now I do this because I knit a lot of swatches in the round. And there's a difference between knitting swatches flat and knitting in the round, because when you're knitting something in the round, you don't have a wrong side of your work that you're knitting. You don't turn your work ever. When you're knitting flat, you have a right side and then you turn your work and you have a wrong side. That's not the way when you're knitting in the round. You only work on what's the right side. So it's something like a stockinette swatch where you're knitting on the right side and then you turn your work and you purl across the wrong side. You don't want to turn your work when you're working in the round, right? You only knit. Stockinette in the round is just knit every row. So you want to reflect that in your gauge. A lot of people find that their purl stitches are a little bit tighter than their knit stitches. So if you knit a swatch that has purl stitches, but your actual project that you're knitting in the round doesn't, there's going to be a discrepancy in the size most likely. So to combat this, we knit without turning our work, which leaves these floats. Now you have the option to cut them and tie them together like I've done here. You can even cut them like extremely short, like I showed you earlier, or even shorter like this one. You have lots of options here. And if I'm trying to save on yarn, like I want to unravel my swatch and keep the yarn for later, like if I know I only have a certain amount of yarn and I might run out, I won't cut the yarn at all. I'll just leave floats, because I can unravel this in one piece. This is an example of one I've been working on recently. It's a 2x2 rib. So here's my cast on edge, and I worked in a 2x2 rib across the row like this, and then I don't turn my work. I just slide it back to the beginning and work again, and that will give you floats in the back. So you'll definitely need circular needles for this, and I really suggest knitting a circular swatch on the cord length needle that you'll be knitting on. But for this, if I'm knitting like a sweater or something, then this cord length is perfectly fine. I'm at the end of a row. Okay, so I started here and I knit across. So I've been doing this work flat, so you can tell there's no tails, but I'm going to show you how you do it working in the round. If I was going to knit flat, I would flip it, but I'm not going to work flat. So I take it and I just pull it to the other end of the other needle. And now I have this big gap between where my yarn is attached and where the beginning of my round is. So I scrunch my stitches up on my needle and I grab the yarn. I'm going to wrap it around a finger on my right hand. Now I'm a continental knitter, so I hold the yarn in my left hand traditionally. So I'm basically just making my finger act as if it was the ball of yarn. So it's giving me tension. So I wrap it around a few times. If you're trying to save on yarn, you want to make sure that the length of yarn in the back is the float, so the amount that you're wrapping around your finger allows this to lay flat. When you're blocking it, you have to have the float long enough that you can lay this flat, or stretch it out if you need to stretch it out. Now that I have tension with my finger, this gives me tension. It makes it a lot easier, I think, to knit. So then I just knit normally. And then after I've knit a few stitches, I can let go of the tension with my right hand and just keep knitting. If you're a thrower or you hold the yarn in your right hand when you knit, you can tension it with your left if you find that to be easier, or you don't have to tension it at all. I just find it's a lot easier that way. So here I've come to the end of my row. It's very loose, so I'm just going to pull on that tail that's behind, right? This float. I'm just going to pull on it to kind of tension that. And again, I'm not going to turn my work. So I just pull on the needle until it's on the other side, and then I repeat that process. Take my working yarn and I wrap it around a finger on my right hand, and then I knit across. You can leave these floats, like I said, you can just leave them in the back like this. That's what I've done here. Or what you can do is you can go ahead and cut them in the middle. It doesn't have to be super exact because these are long floats. So this looks super messy. I don't really like this, which is why I always trim them. So what I do, you can do this with the right side showing or the wrong side showing. It doesn't really matter, but I go down and I start with the first two. I just take two that are close together. I just tie them in a knot and then tie them in a knot a second time. And then I cut close. Not too close that I think they're going to unravel, because that will unravel your row. So I'm careful that I always pull really tight when I'm double knotting. I don't pull tight the first knot, but I definitely pull tight the second knot. And then I just move up to the next two. And you can kind of pull on the yarn to make sure that the stitches that they're attached to are a more normal size. So you don't want to pull super, super tight on the first knot because you're not trying to pucker the edges. If you pull too tight on the first knot, it'll kind of pucker the side of your swatch and make it really hard to measure. So I just loosely knot it, and then I go in and knot it a second time tighter. And you notice that when I do the second knot, it doesn't pull on my stitches at all because I did the first knot. And then I cut it and I just do that all the way up. And eventually it'll look like this. When you're done with your swatch or your swatches, let's say you're making them in different needle sizes. Like here I have two in different needle sizes. This one is much bigger and looser than this one. So you can see, I think I cast on the same amount and did close to the same amount of rows, but this one is much taller. You want to block it in the same way that you're going to block your project. So I always wash my sweaters. So I washed these. So I soaked them in water, drained off the water, put them in a towel to squeeze out the excess water. You don't want to like wring them out because that will stretch the stitches in weird ways. That I just kind of like fold them over in a towel and step on them to get excess water out. And then I just lay them flat to dry. Now, if you're really trying to like match gauge, you don't want to have to be pinning like crazy to get it unless the pattern tells you to, like with ribbing, because ribbing has so much stretch. If you want the ribbing to show really well, you can pin it out. But when you take the pins out, it will shrink a little bit. But as a good rule of thumb, you don't want to overstretch your swatch. I don't usually pin out my swatches. I lay them out, let them dry, see what happens. And if it's only ever so slightly off from what I'm trying to achieve, I know that I can probably pin it out in the final project to get it to be the right size. And I guess one thing about pinning out swatches is if you're doing something standard, like just a normal knit and purl pattern, I don't tend to pin those out because I like to see how they lay naturally. But with lace is different. So you can kind of see the curly edge here because I pinned it. And that's what allowed it to really just open up and lay flat. So if you're doing lace, you'll want to pin it. But I'd say with just like a standard knit and purl, I don't typically, unless I'm using like a super fine yarn. So I did, I think, probably pin this with the wrong side showing because I wanted the edges not to curl. It's kind of a situational thing. With a lot of these, especially using worsted weight yarn, I did not pin these. They just kind of relaxed and laid flat. But with this, because I was using such fine yarn, like it's super, super thin, I did pin it so that the edges wouldn't curl. Now I didn't stretch it, but I just pinned it as it was laying versus a rib. Now, if you want the rib to show, again, you want to pin it a little bit. It just depends on the project that you're knitting and your personal preference. So one final thing, if you do knit 2 swatches or more with different needle sizes, what I like to do is I thread a different yarn. It can be the same yarn, doesn't really matter, but I thread my final stitches onto waste yarn instead of binding them off because it lets the stitches lay more naturally. And then what I do is once I knot the top, I make extra knots to correspond to the needle size that I used. So here I have 10 knots, so I know I used a US 10, and I think I wrote down which one this used, which I think was a US 8. So that way you know pretty easily right off the bat what needle size you used, because a lot of times you're going to forget which is which. I knit these 2 swatches a couple months ago and they're vastly different. This one is much, much bigger, as you can tell, and I didn't write down the needle size. I have no idea what needle size I used for either of these. So I'm going to have to re-knit a swatch now because of that mistake. Gauge is the amount of stitches and rows per inch. And if a pattern says rounds, that's the same thing as a row. A round is just a row when you're knitting in the round. And a swatch is what you make. It's a smaller piece of fabric that you knit up so that you can measure a gauge. So I know that was a very lengthy video, but I hope you guys kind of understand more what gauge and swatching is. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys found that helpful. If you did, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos.